Zivai arrived from Harare, from her small village of Domboshava, carrying a small suitcase and big dreams. The city, with its towering buildings and bustling streets, was overwhelming, but she was determined to succeed. She had secured a job as a housemaid for the Moyo family, a wealthy couple living in an upscale suburb. Mrs. Moyo, her new employer, was a stern woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. The moment Zivai stepped into the Moyo household, she was put to work. From dawn till dusk, she scrubbed, cooked, and cleaned under the relentless supervision of Mrs. Moyo. Mr. Moyo was a quiet man, always absorbed in his work or distracted by the demands of city life. He barely noticed Zivai, who was just another servant in his eyes. The days were long and exhausting, and the city that had once seemed full of promise quickly became a place of endless toil for Zivai. She found herself longing for the simplicity of her village, but she knew she couldn't return home empty-handed. She had to endure, no matter how difficult the situation was. But as the days passed, Zivai began to realize just how cruel Mrs. Moyo could be. Mrs. Moyo was an impossible woman to please. Zivai quickly learned that no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. If the floors sparkled, Mrs. Moyo would complain that they were too slippery. If the food was perfectly seasoned, she would say that it was too salty. Every day, Zivai was met with harsh words and criticism. Zivai's hands became rough and calloused from the constant scrubbing, and her spirit was worn down by the endless demands. Despite her best efforts, she was always met with Mrs. Moyo's scorn. The madam treated her more like a machine than a human being, expecting perfection in every task. Zivai began to dread each day, knowing that no matter how hard she tried, she would never earn Mrs. Moyo's approval. The city, which had once seemed like a land of opportunity, now felt like a prison, with Mrs. Moyo as the cruel warden. Zivai's dreams of a better life were fading, replaced by a deepening resentment towards the woman who made her life so miserable. As the weeks passed, Zivai's resentment towards Mrs. Moyo grew stronger. She had left her family and the familiarity of her village for this? To be treated like dirt beneath someone's shoe? The thought of returning home a failure with nothing but tales of her suffering was unbearable. Zivai began to fantasize about ways to get back at Mrs. Moyo, to make her feel the pain she inflicted on others. Her anger simmered beneath the surface, fueled by each cruel word and unreasonable demand. One day, as she was scrubbing the kitchen floor, Zivai overheard Mrs. Moyo talking on the phone, belittling her to a friend. The words cut deep, and something inside Zivai snapped. She couldn't keep enduring this treatment without doing something to change her situation. It was then that a dangerous idea began to take root in her mind. If she could win over Mr. Moyo, she could turn the tables on Mrs. Moyo. She noticed the distance between the couple, the lack of warmth or affection. Perhaps there was a way she could use that to her advantage. Zivai began to observe Mr. Moyo closely, noting how he seemed indifferent to his wife. There was no love between them, only the cold routine of a long, unhappy marriage. The idea of winning his affections, of becoming the mistress of the house, began to appeal to her more and more. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival and securing a better life for herself. But Zivai knew that seducing Mr. Moyo wouldn't be easy, and she needed help to make her plan succeed. She remembered the stories from her village about a powerful witch doctor who could make the impossible happen, but for a price. The thought of using dark magic frightened her, but Zivai was desperate. She couldn't bear the thought of spending the rest of her life as a mere maid at the mercy of Mrs. Moyo's cruelty. The idea of becoming the madam of the house was intoxicating, and the more she thought about it, the more determined she became. She decided that on her next day off, she would return to her village and seek out the witch doctor, no matter the cost. On a rare day off, Zivai traveled back to Domboshawa. The journey was long, and as the city's tall buildings gave way to the dusty roads of her village, she felt a mix of relief and trepidation. The familiar sights and sounds of her home brought back memories of simpler times, but the purpose of her visit weighed heavily on her mind. She was not returning as the same innocent girl who had left. She was now a woman with a dark purpose. Zivai made her way to the edge of the village, where the old witch doctor lived in a secluded hut. The air around the hut was thick with scent of herbs and smoke, and the villagers avoided it, fearful of the power that resided within. Zivai hesitated at the door, her heart pounding in her chest, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. Gathering her courage, she knocked on the door. The witch doctor, a woman with piercing eyes and an air of quiet menace, opened the door as if she had been expecting her. Without a word, she gestured for Zivai to enter. Inside the witch doctor's hut, the air was thick with the scent of burning herbs and a sense of foreboding. The witch doctor, with her weathered face and knowing eyes, listened as Zivai explained her situation. She spoke of the cruelty she endured, of her desire to win Mr. Moyo's love and take Mrs. Moyo's place as the madam of the house. The witch doctor remained silent, her gaze never leaving Zivai's face. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "The magic you seek is powerful and dangerous," the witch doctor warned. "It will bind Mr. Moyo's heart to yours, but it will also bring a curse upon anyone who tries to break it. Are you willing to accept the consequences?" Zivai, driven by desperation and ambition, nodded without hesitation. The witch doctor prepared a charm for her, a small, intricately carved object infused with dark magic. She gave Zivai specific instructions on how to use it, emphasizing that once the spell was cast, there would be no turning back. Zivai left the hut with the charm in her hand, her heart racing with a mix of fear and anticipation. She returned to Harare with the charm hidden carefully in her belongings. As she entered the Moyo household, she felt a new sense of confidence. The witch doctor's instructions echoed in her mind, and she wasted no time in setting her plan into motion. That night, when the house was quiet and everyone was asleep, Zivai crept into Mr. Moyo's room. She placed the charm under his pillow, her hands trembling slightly as she whispered the incantation that would bind his heart to hers. As she finished the incantation, a strange energy seemed to fill the room. Zivai quickly left, returning to her own small quarters, her heart pounding. She had done it, and there was no turning back now. The next morning, Mr. Moyo seemed different. He looked at Zivai in a way he had never done before, his eyes lingering on her with a new intensity. Over the next few days, his attention grew more obvious. He began to seek her out, finding excuses to be near her and to talk to her. Zivai played her part well, acting surprised by his attention, even as she reveled in her newfound power. It wasn't long before the charm's effects became undeniable. Mr. Moyo's affection for Zivai grew rapidly, turning from a mild interest to an obsessive love. He began spending more time with her, offering to help her with chores or bringing her small gifts. His once distant demeanor melted away, replaced by an almost boyish infatuation. Zivai could hardly believe how quickly the magic had worked. She found herself in the center of Mr. Moyo's world, the object of his undivided attention. Meanwhile, Mrs. Moyo noticed the changes in her husband, but dismissed them as part of his midlife crisis. She had no reason to suspect that her humble housemaid was the cause of this transformation. However, her demeanor became harsher, as if she could sense that something was amiss, but couldn't quite place it. She began to lash out at Zivai even more, her words dripping with venom. Zivai, though, took it all in her stride, knowing that soon Mrs. Moyo would get what she deserved. But as the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. Mrs. Moyo's health started to decline, a development that Zivai hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Moyo's health continued to deteriorate, and the atmosphere in the house grew tense. She complained of constant headaches, fatigue, and a feeling of unease that she couldn't shake. She became more irritable, her temper flaring at the slightest provocation. Zivai watched all this with a mixture of guilt and satisfaction. She hadn't intended for Mrs. Moyo to suffer physically. Her plan had been to replace her, not to harm her. Yet, there was a part of her that felt justified in her actions, given the way Mrs. Moyo had treated her. As Mr. Moyo's affection for Zivai intensified, so did his wife's suffering. It was as if the charm was draining Mrs. Moyo of her life force, transferring her vitality to Zivai. The housemaid's beauty and energy seemed to increase, while Mrs. Moyo's faded before their eyes. Zivai tried to ignore the nagging feeling that she had unleashed something terrible, focusing instead on the affection she was finally receiving. One fateful morning, Zivai found Mrs. Moyo's lifeless body in her bedroom, a look of agony frozen on her face. Panic gripped as she realized the full extent of what she had done. Mr. Moyo was devastated by his wife's sudden death, his grief overwhelming his senses. He clung to Zivai, the only solace he seemed to find in his world of sorrow. The household was thrown into chaos, with whispers of foul play floating in the neighborhood. In the days that followed, the funeral arrangements were made swiftly, almost hastily, as if Mr. Moyo wanted to rid himself of the memory of his wife's painful end. Zivai stood by him, her guilt a heavy cloak around her shoulders, even as she received the comfort and attention she had longed for. Yet the house felt emptier, colder, as if Mrs. Moyo's spirit lingered, unhappy and unavenged. After the funeral, unsettling occurrences began to disrupt the once peaceful home. Zivai felt an icy presence watching her, and shadows flickered at the corners of her vision. At night, the sound of Mrs. Moyo's voice echoed through the corridors, a soft, spiteful whisper that only Zivai could hear. Objects would move inexplicably, and the air would sometimes turn frigid without reason. Zivai tried to convince herself that it was her imagination, her guilt manifesting in these terrifying experiences. However, the haunting grew more intense, and soon there was no denying that Mrs. Moyo's spirit was not at rest. Zivai lived in a state of constant fear, her nights haunted by nightmares of Mrs. Moyo's accusing eyes. One night, Zivai experienced a vivid dream where Mrs. Moyo confronted her. In the dream, the madam was surrounded by a dark, watery abyss, her face contorted with rage. "You took everything from me, but I will not rest until I have taken everything from you," she hissed. Zivai woke up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. The dream felt like a warning, and the line between the dream the dream world and reality began to blur. The days that followed were filled with dread. Zivai could feel Mrs. Moy's presence growing stronger and more assertive. The ghostly occurrences were no longer limited to the night, but began to invade the daylight hours as well. Zivai's sanity began to fray at the edges as she grappled with the consequences of her actions. Desperate for a solution, she returned to the witch doctor in her village, seeking a way to end the haunting. The witch doctor, however, greeted her with a somber expression. "The spirit of the woman you have wronged is powerful and filled with rage," she said. "You unleashed this curse with your desires, and it is tethered to your soul." The witch doctor explained that there was no simple remedy. No charm or spell could undo what she had done. "You must find a way to make amends with the spirit, to quell her wrath," she advised, leaving Zivai with more questions than answers. Back in Harare, the hauntings escalated. Mrs. Moyo's apparition began to appear more frequently. Her spectral form, a chilling sight that left Zivai paralyzed with fear. The ghost seemed bent on revenge, making Zivai's life a living hell. She would awake to find herself in different parts of the house, with no memory of how she got there. The nights were tormented with visions of her own demise, echoes of the fate she had unwittingly caused for Mrs. Moyo. The house became a prison, with Mr. Moyo too blinded by his grief and infatuation to notice the strange occurrences. Zivai knew that she had to find a way to appease Mrs. Moyo's spirit, but she was at a loss. How could she make amends to a spirit driven by such deep anger and resentment? Zivai's reality continued to crumble as the boundary between the living and the dead grew even more tenuous. The once vibrant and ambitious village girl was now a shadow of her former self, haunted not only by the ghost of Mrs. Moyo, but also by her own guilt and fear. Each day was a battle against the unseen forces that seemed determined to destroy her. Her relationship with Mr. Moyo, once her only solace, became strained as he noticed her increasing paranoia and erratic behavior. Zivai felt isolated, trapped in a nightmare of her own making. The house, once a symbol of her ascension from the village to the city, now felt like a haunted mausoleum, echoing with the ghost's wrath and her own cries of despair.